This week, the Pope announces another trip, the Synod on the Family is over, and the Church looks at the Middle East. Hello and welcome to this edition of Vatican Connections. The Synod of Bishops on the Family is over, and Pope Paul VI is officially blessed. But there's other things going on to tell you about. This week, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis will visit Turkey at the end of November. He will leave Rome on November 28th, visit Ankara, where he will meet with government officials, and then visit Istanbul, where he will stop at the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque. The Pope will also take part in an ecumenical prayer service and meet privately with Patriarch Bartholomew. The Pope will celebrate one public Mass during that visit, a Divine Liturgy in Istanbul. After the close of the Extraordinary Synod of Bishops, the cardinals present in Rome were invited to a consistory to discuss the current situation in the Middle East. The consistory had been scheduled some time ago, but it was originally supposed to be to decide on two causes for canonization. Pope Francis amended the agenda to include a discussion on the Middle East. Now he told the cardinals, "We cannot resign ourselves to thinking of the Middle East without Christians," and he reiterated the desire for peace in the region. The Vatican released a summary of what was discussed in the consistory, and one interesting issue brought up was the fact that school books tend to speak positively only about the religion that is the official state religion, or the religion favored by the state. The cardinals said the issue requires some further reflection on the part of different organizations and institutions currently working in the region. As for the two new saints that were discussed, Blessed Giuseppe Vaz will be canonized January 14th, 2015, and Blessed Maria Cristina of the Immaculate Conception will also be canonized, but no date has been set. Turning to the Extraordinary Synod of Bishops on the Family, the events of the last 2 weeks have many people asking, now what? Cardinal Donald World helped with the final document from the Synod, and Catholic News Service spoke to him about that document and what went into bringing it together.
I think what we saw and what we ended up with was the result of a free and open process. The Pope at the very beginning said, "Speak with clarity and charity, and listen with humility." And that's what happened. I think if there was any glitch along the way, it was the interim relatio was seen by many as not being as balanced as it should have been. At least from their perspective, it wasn't as reflective of the balance in the discussions. It was really important that that final relatio be a consensus document. There were a number of things that you see in this final document that were only lightly touched upon, and then there were things you see in that interim that aren't in here at all. The whole idea of this gradualism, you don't see that in the final document because the small language groups said, yes, it was said, but it didn't garner support. At the very end, there was the Relatio Synodi, the final piece of work, saying, this is what we think we heard. And you know what verifies that for me? Every single one of those paragraphs received a majority, and only a handful didn't receive the 2/3. What I think Pope Francis succeeded in doing was letting the Synod fathers, letting the Synod participants actually come to a real consensus, even though it's a weak consensus in some areas. That's going to be the working paper, the lineamenta for the next Synod. Between now and next October, I think there's going to be so much fruitful discussion in the Church. We've had such an airing, such an expression of the problematic, that when this is sent out now as a working paper to conferences of bishops all over the world, I think we're going to be hearing more and more the positive side, because that will be the natural reaction to say, okay, we heard a lot of this, but I think we're going to hear from people who are living the wonder of what the Church has experienced and presented from the beginning. Now, I think we're going to be able to celebrate that and find there are a lot of people living it, struggling to live it, and I think they're going to be the witnesses to the next Synod. They're going to be the ones in the next Synod who will be bearing witness to what's ahead of us and what we can be.
Dealing with such delicate topics can be tricky. A certain balance needs to be struck in order to stay on course. Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of the U.S. Bishops' Conference spoke to CNS about that aspect of this synod.
When we looked at the movement that happened this week, I think the initial document left people with many questions and things that might be taken in a number of ways. And we didn't want to leave the synod with that lack of clarity. And so I think the deepening and the clarifying that I felt was necessary was really coming from how what we say is grounded in sacred scripture and in the tradition of the Church, in which the teachings of Jesus, of course, are preserved. Any efforts going out to reach, for example, those people who are in the painful situation of divorce and remarriage, civil remarriage, they're in a situation in which the Church needs to reach out, welcome, and accompany. Now, I got the clear sense that a major consensus was on looking at the way annulments are done and how accessible annulments can be, without violating, of course, the bond of marriage, to be able to reach out. And I saw that as being a clear signal that had the consensus. The big message that I take home is, obviously, there is a place for everyone in the Church. And I think that means that people of same-sex attraction are welcome within the Church. We all together seek to live chaste and good lives and to help each other in that process. The opportunity that delegates had in the past to have their interventions made public is something that I think should be returned to. I think in hindsight, there was the sense, I guess, that well, maybe that would inhibit people from speaking out, but I don't think that's the case. So my fond hope and really my urging, if people ask me about this, would be to say, no, return to that process, so that that's another level of transparency. This Extraordinary Synod concentrated on the challenges. Next time, we're going to be coming together, those who are appointed as delegates, to look at the vocation and mission of the family in the light of the teachings of Christ and in the light of evangelization. I guess I would anticipate that all the consultation that happened this past year will continue, and maybe even in a more refined way. I think the key will be not simply for us to share what's on the top of our minds, but rather informed by this document now. We will be on the threshold of saying, well, now as I refine my thinking, here's what I think we need to renew family and to renew marriage within the world and within our church.
The Synod of Bishops as we know it today was created by Pope Paul VI, and he was beatified at the close of this Extraordinary Synod. Now, our team had a chance to speak to one person who worked very closely with him. Cardinal Justin Rigali shared with us his memories of working with Paul VI.
From the very first moment, he lent himself with enthusiasm, with vigor, with trust in the Lord, and with a great deal of faith in Christ. And he knew that the council was all about the church, but he also knew that the church was all about Christ. And therefore, the years of the implementation under Pope Paul VI of the Vatican Council were years of more concentration on the mystery of the incarnate Word, on the mystery of Jesus Christ, on the mystery of the church. If I can quote, to give you an idea, some years later, he was giving a talk, Paul VI. I was present. It was in St. Peter's Square. And he was giving an exegesis, an explanation of the Gospel of St. Matthew, the 16th chapter. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Well, he chose to emphasize one particular word in that short quote, and his voice rang out over St. Peter's Square. You are Peter, Jesus says, and upon this rock I will build my church. And the Pope emphasized that the church belongs completely to Jesus Christ. And no one must ever, under any circumstances, think he possesses the church. No, it just belongs to Jesus Christ. So, as the Pope would implement the documents of the Second Vatican Council with great fidelity, he would also constantly return to the Christocentric nature of the church. And that was to show his mentality, that was to show his great passion for Jesus and his church, and it would also determine the superb quality of his implementation. Actually, I wrote a book some years ago, inspired by Pope Paul VI, and I said the title of my book was Reliving Vatican II. It's all about Jesus Christ. So that was the title. But that's the inspiration that I received from Paul VI.
The modern history of the papacy, Pope Paul VI's papacy, is actually relatively long, 15 years.
15 and a half.
15 and a half years. And I think maybe it's overshadowed by the length of John Paul II's, and very often Pope Paul VI seems to be forgotten. But now he's being beatified during this Synod of Bishops. But you knew him personally. You had the chance to be close to him when he was Pope. What kind of person was he? What was he like?
That's an excellent question, because that is already an indication that tells so much about him. What he was able to do, we say in Latin, agere sequitur esse. The way we act follows upon what we are, who we are. And Paul VI, his person, his personality was so rich and so human, and that it was a great aid for him in his ministry. If I can cite the example of that, for me is one of my most cherished memories of being with him personally during the 8.5 years that I was privileged to be his English language translator. And one night he called me to discuss a particular matter that was before him. He was going to approve something. He wanted to make sure he was very accurate with the nuances of the English language in this particular matter. And at the end of our meeting, as I was going out, around 7 o'clock in the evening, I was going out of his study, and I said, "Good night, Holy Father," and he stopped me, and he said to me, "How is Paul?" And Paul was my brother, and some time before I had asked him to please pray for my brother Paul, because my brother Paul was 50 years old. He was the father of 12 children, and he was dying of cancer. And the Pope had this enormous sense of humanity and charity, of love and concern, to inquire of all his billion Catholics at that time, how is Paul? But he had 4 questions. How is Paul? How is his wife holding up? How are the children doing? What can I do? I mean, this speaks of Paul VI. Another time, I remember I was with him as he was giving an interview to the Japanese television. And they came up, and I was standing next to him, and the first thing they asked him was, "Your Holiness, what was your mother like?" Well, he beamed, and in his response he began saying, "Oh, her name was Judith." And then he went on from there and said, as I recall, something to the effect that if there's anything good in me, I owe an awful lot of it to my mother. But the humanity of Paul VI is worthy of special attention because it was truly there, and sometimes we pass over it.
He clearly had a very close connection with the human family. He had a strong desire to reach out to people, to bring people together. He was a promoter of dialogue, and in this particular context that we're speaking, he's the father of the modern Synods of Bishops. Considering that we have the Synod of Bishops on the family, and we're talking about Paul VI in particular, what do you think the lasting message is of Blessed Paul VI for family life today and for the renewal of the Synods of Bishops that is now happening under Pope Francis?
I think that his message is he would be one who would cry out with Pope St. Leo the Great back on Christmas Day, "Oh Christian, recognize your dignity. Oh family, realize how much you're worth." And that would be his message. I would be with him on many, many occasions when I would be translating for English-speaking people, but also close enough to be involved to overhear the conversation in other languages that the Pope would have. And I remember people that would come to him after the audience. They would be his young people that he once was a chaplain to in his activities in the Secretariat of State. And he would speak to them, and with this warmth, because they were his young people. And he would remind them, or he would bring up the names of their children and say, "How is so-and-so? I baptized him or her, didn't I? And how are they doing?" But it started with this concern, and but a concern that was based on how precious is the family, how precious is God's gift of the vocation of Christian married love, and of being parents and being spouses. And this motivated him to do everything that he possibly could do.
Cardinal Rigali, thank you very much for joining us.
You're most welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Like everyone who was involved with the Synod, Pope Francis kept a light schedule this week. Sunday was the Beatification of Paul VI, presided by Pope Francis and attended by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. CNS has more.
Nei confronti di questo grande Papa, di questo coraggioso cristiano, di questo instancabile apostolo davanti a Dio oggi, non possiamo che dire una parola tanto semplice quanto sincera ed importante. Grazie. Grazie. Grazie nostro caro e amato Papa Paolo VI. Grazie. Grazie per la tua umile e profetica testimonianza di amore a Cristo e alla sua Chiesa.
Wednesday was, of course, his general audience. Pope Francis kept that appointment, and CNS has more on this week's catechesis.
Oggi celebriamo la memoria liturgica di San Giovanni Paolo II. Il quale ha invitato tutti ad aprire le porte a Cristo. Nella sua prima visita nella vostra patria ha invocato lo Spirito Santo perché scendesse a rinnovare la terra della Polonia. A tutto il mondo ha ricordato il mistero della Divina Misericordia. La sua eredità spirituale non sia dimenticata, ma ci spinga alla riflessione e al concreto agire per il bene della Chiesa, della famiglia e della società. Sia lodato Gesù Cristo.
Also on Wednesday, Pope Francis met with the President of Grenada. They spoke about the important role that the Church has played in education in that country. And on Thursday, Pope Francis spoke to the International Association of Penal Law. Now, he called for an end to capital punishment, but also said lifetime sentences are little more than a hidden death penalty. Vatican Connections is interactive. We answer your questions and explain things you want to know. You can reach us on Twitter at VatiConnections or by email at info@saltandlighttv.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions during this part of our show. Well, that's it for Vatican Connections this week. Join us again next time for more of what's going on at the heart of the Church. And as always, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or check our blog for regular updates. From everyone here, thanks for watching. See you next time.